Restoring Men in History, the Constitution, the American founding, James Madison, Federalist 45, very important, very relevant today. What's he going to talk about here? Well, the balance between state and federal power. He goes into that in this paper, how it's going to work out, how everybody's going to get along. So here we go. What does it mean for us today? How far have we moved away from it? What's he writing about? Remember the Constitutional Convention, what happened? They proposing now to be ratified by the states. He's writing this to New York. He wants New York to come in and ratify it. They're proposing a limited government. They need the states to ratify it. Madison argues in this paper that the new Constitution will create a limited government, leaving most authority with whom? The states. That's his promise. That's his commitment here. In this paper, he also states one of my favorite lines in all of the Federalist Papers, that the federal government's powers will be few and defined. He also tells us what the federal government's focus will be. Federal government will focus on national areas like defense, trade, and foreign affairs. How are they doing on that? Make a comment if you believe they got away from defense, trade, and foreign affairs. And what will the states focus on? You ready? Everything else. Meaning domestic and local issues will be handled by the states. How far away are we from what he promised and committed to? Hit the subscribe and like button if you like history, men, these topics, and we would appreciate that. Before we get to the main and most important part of the paper, which is one of my favorite pieces, and that really defines the balance of power between state and federal governments, let's do this. And we'll start with a direct quote before we get to the really important part of this. The state governments may be regarded as constituent and essential parts of the federal government, whilst the latter is no wise essential to the operation or the organization of the former. Now, why is he talking about this? Well, he goes through the paper and he talks about how people are going to be elected and the states are going to have influence in that. We've already changed with the 17th Amendment. He talks about the state legislature picking the senators. Well, we've changed that, but that's okay because that didn't change Article 1, Section 8. What does that mean? Article 1, Section 8 is where most of the powers of the federal government that we argue about today are in it. There's a few other powers, but mainly Article 1, Section 8 defines the enumerated few specific powers of the federal government. And electing senators in a different manner didn't change that, although what it could have changed is they didn't have as much loyalty to their state. Could, right? But anyway, what does it also say? State governments existed before the federal government, and they will go on after, and they don't need the federal government to operate. So there will be a dependency on the states from the federal government. He's making this argument. Next quote, the state governments will in all possible contingencies afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. So, the state governments will be what? A check on the federal government. You have representation in the House that's coming from your state, and they will be responsive to you because they're elected every 2 years. You still have the Senate. They're just not elected by the state legislature, and you have to deal with the states in that. In addition, you saw what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison did with the Kentucky-Virginia resolution, so the state can check the authority of the federal government, and this is James Madison writing. So the next point, he talks about the Articles of Confederation. He talks about the invigoration of powers, not new powers, except for commerce. So they're only adding, he says, the commerce power. So Article 1, Section 8, still right there. They're only adding one thing from the Articles of Confederation. So there's not going to be much change, guys. Don't worry about it. Federal government's not going to be able to overreach. You got this. Now, he makes another point. He states that people are naturally more attached to their state governments, which will protect against federal encroachment. Now, we'll talk about this point. I do want to mention it, but the more federal programs you have, right, this is going to detract from that, right? Because the people's attachment might go from the state government to the federal government if there are huge entitlements coming from the federal government. So that could be a problem today, right? Is a problem. So here's the most important part of this paper in my mind. I've always enjoyed this, and it makes it very clear. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will for the most part be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs, listen to this one, this is good, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. Pretty huge and clear. The state does everything, almost. The operations of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger, those of the state governments in times of peace and security. Do you think we followed that? Make a comment if you can come up with an example of overreach if you want to, and I will read it. So that doesn't give the federal government much power, does it? So the state will handle almost everything, right? All domestic concerns, state or local, depending on how your state constitution is written. Morals, marriage, abortion, gun rights, police, healthcare, education, schools, and the environment will all be handled at the state level. Almost everything is to be handled at the state level according to Federalist 45 and what he's talking about here, right? He just said it, roads, entitlements. So you can look and see how far the federal government has gone beyond their powers. If something has really bothered you, where they have gone over, feel free to make a comment about what bothers you the most and where they've gone over. So federal overreach, gun control, Affordable Care Act, EPA and environmental laws. Just a few examples. Clean Power Plan 2015, the EPA regulation aimed to reduce carbon emissions from power plants, setting state-specific targets for shifting to renewables. Now, there are a lot of critics about this, arguing it goes beyond the Constitution. Offshore and public land energy restrictions, federal bans or moratoriums on oil and gas leasing in areas like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, offshore drilling zones. Department of Education, renewable energy mandates, federal incentives or mandates pushing states toward wind, solar, or electric vehicle infrastructure. Inflation Reduction Act of 22 subsidies can pressure states into aligning with federal priorities even if their local economies favor fossil fuels or they need different kinds of energy or want different kinds of energy, right? That's a state decision. Federal government shouldn't be coercing states in doing that. What about these things? And once they've been promised, you have to still give it to people. So I'm not saying, I'm just making a constitutional point here. Medicare, Social Security, all health powers were reserved to the state. Police powers were reserved to the states. Education was reserved to the state. Department of Education, EPA. No Child Left Behind, Common Core. Federal grants with strings attached could be seen again as coercive, right? Undermining what? Sovereignty of the states. The 10th Amendment, all federal overreach. So most of the federal government's powers are articulated in Article 1, Section 8. If they go beyond that, they've committed overreach. Which area concerns you the most? Leave us a comment and I will read it if it's about overreach. If you want us to cover another Federalist paper or something about the American founding, let me know. If you learned something from this, please hit subscribe and like. Thank you very much.